I'm Nick Thieberger. I'm an Associate Professor in Linguistics at the University of Melbourne.
Hi, my name is Eleanor Jorgensen. I'm a sign linguist here at the University of Melbourne Language Documentation Lab.
Hello, my name is Jack Augustin and I am a PhD candidate at Melbourne University and I'm working here in the Language Documentation Lab.
Hi, my name's Tula Wynyard and I'm a postgrad student here at the University of Melbourne.
I am studying a Tibeto-Burman language called Jogalai, spoken in northeastern India.
I'm working on a PhD documenting Ritharana Wagalak, which is a language spoken in Arnhem Land.
I'm focusing on signing varieties in Hawaii, specifically how signers encode temporal information. So expressing how an event unfolds over time or when that event occurs in relation to other events.
I basically started studying languages when I was at school and got interested in linguistics, and I'm really interested in Aboriginal languages, partially because of my own Darug heritage from Sydney, but also because Australian languages are really diverse and complex and have not been well documented for the most part.
In Australia there are probably 800 languages. In Vanuatu there are 130 languages, and most of them don't have written form, they don't have a grammar written about them or a collection of stories or a dictionary. So that's what I did in the end for my PhD, was that research on a language from central Vanuatu. And I wrote a grammar and collection of stories and a dictionary in that language.
I've been working with this community, in particular one signer in Hawaii, for the last 2 years. So I have already a standing connection with that community. And when I decided that I wanted to do a PhD, it's rare that you get 3 years of your life to really focus on something, and if it can be useful to a community. For me, I would like to approach my research like, yes, I'm interested in a particular question that I want to ask and investigate, but also what other things can come out of that same research. So I'm giving my time to this community because it is worthwhile for them to have language materials to preserve this language. This particular one variety, so what would be called Hawaii Sign Language, although that term itself is a bit fraught, which is why I'm using quotes. Only the oldest generation of signers still use and know this language. So for me to be able to come in and work with them is a really precious experience, because this is something that they will then be able to pass down to generations of the deaf community in Hawaii and to their families, who themselves are usually not deaf. But being able to capture the life stories of people in their language is a really powerful thing. And language documentation of sign languages in general also has an important, I suppose, like validation that they're real languages. And that comes from very early research on sign languages in the 60s from William Stokoe. He was the first, his project was the first to prove, yes, sign languages are real languages with proof, and then that is a very important tool for advocacy and essentially recognition of deaf communities as cultural minorities.
So I believe that language documentation is a vital aspect of the role of a linguist as a researcher, because language diversity across the world is it's wild. There's thousands and thousands of languages, but a lot of languages, especially in our modern day with globalization and development and industrialization, there's a lot of languages are vulnerable and will likely, many of them, thousands, will probably go extinct within the next 100 years. So it is our duty as linguists to document and preserve these languages, both just for the general fact of our interest in languages, but also for those communities, so that they can have evidence and documentation of their, because language is an inherent part of culture. That's just my opinion, but I feel like a lot of linguists feel the same way, that it is a fundamental part of people's culture and identity, and preserving that is I feel like it's a very, very valuable thing, both for like the world and just people, like just the corpus of like cultural artifacts, I guess, that already exist. But like language is just one part of that. Yeah.
The language situation in each place obviously is very different in the Pacific and in Australia. In Australia, Aboriginal people have been here for a very long time. They've suffered terribly because of colonisation, but there are also resources now available for them to set up language centres, to set up language programs and that kind of thing. In the Pacific, there's not so much money available for language work. It's just not a big priority, but it really differs from country to country. So in some countries, so Polynesian countries, typically there's one language for the whole country. So Tonga, Samoa, Kiribati, these are all countries that have one language, and that makes it easier to resource the schools and to have bilingual programs. But in other countries, and particularly in Melanesia, you have many, many languages. So Papua New Guinea is the most notorious example with somewhere around 900 languages. But Vanuatu, as I said, is 130 languages. So it's very difficult for the government to provide resources. In a population of 300,000 people, they're just not able to do that. So they do rely on outsiders coming in and writing, grammars, doing PhD research and so on. And then each of these countries also has a different approach to supporting research or not. So in Vanuatu, you have to get a research permit from the Vanuatu Cultural Centre, and you have to commit to doing something that they call national service. That is, you have to do something in return for your own research. So for a linguist, that would be producing a book of stories or a dictionary for the language. So I suppose that they're the sort of main ways in which they're different. The other thing is that in the Pacific, these are sovereign countries, and so they make up their own mind about how things should operate. In Australia, Aboriginal people aren't sovereign. They can assert their rights over things, but they are, within a broader society, and so they don't have as much ability to determine what happens, with their languages.
I think there's a kind of misrepresentation of linguists sometimes that we can save languages, and we really can't. Only the community can do that. It's really within the power of the speakers passing on to their younger people, and for the majority of people that I talk to, that's something that's really forefront. What we can do, however, is create lasting records that can be used for multiple purposes. So a grammar really is something that I see as kind of like the soil that you can grow multiple things out of. Ideally, a good grammar is multifunctional and transparent, and you can kind of return to it over and over and use it to produce different things. So whether that's teaching and learning materials, whether it's something for like academic typological analysis, a good grammar does all that.
So the whole discipline of linguistics and the way it relates to speakers of Indigenous languages has really changed over the last generation, I think. It was acceptable in the past for researchers to go into communities, collect material and leave the communities and have very little left behind. But it's not acceptable anymore. And what we now really encourage in our students too is that they produce good documentation of the languages. That means recordings, recording people with video, trying to prepare materials that can be used for language revitalisation as well as for linguistic analysis, and also materials that are useful in the community like storybooks and dictionaries and that kind of thing. And another part of that is archiving primary language records. So in the past, again, typically people might have made recordings on audio tape. Often they didn't, but if they did make them on audio tape, they kept them in their homes, and at the end of their research careers, they were just left there. There was nobody looking after them. So with a group of people, we set up a digital archive for this material called Paradisic, and that has now been digitising and collecting digitising analogue materials, but also collecting born digital materials, and there's 16,000 hours of audio in the collection representing 1,370 languages. So we train our students so that when they do fieldwork, they produce good records and recordings, and they manage all of that, because there's a whole data management task involved in doing that as well. And all of that's done because there's a recognition that we need to return materials to the people that we record, and we need to work collaboratively with them so that they understand what we're doing and we understand what they want us to do, so that it's not just an extractive process by us, but it's a collaborative process that everybody benefits from.
All linguists work with language as their data. I think that the difference with language documentation is the fact that we are working with communities very closely, and we might come in with a research question, but we're always considering what the community will benefit from that sort of research. So we're trying to essentially get a snapshot of a language as it is used, and we might zoom in kind of on one particular aspect for our research, but having that kind of more complete snapshot is really beneficial, especially, for instance, in context. A lot of people in this lab work in contexts of colonisation and either language shift or loss or contact, which makes language both a political thing and something very precious.
I suppose one of the main things about language, so within a language community people are doing things, but if you want that language to be represented outside of the language community to the broader public, there has to be some mechanism. So archiving is an important way of doing that, because the records that you create are then available for others. And for example, we've had artists using recordings from our collection in quite big and beautiful language installations, and they do it in a very respectful way, and they acknowledge each of the speakers when they do it. We've got a lot of music and singing and instrumental music in the collection as well, so there's a lot of scope for celebrating language through using archival materials. Yeah.
The other great thing that comes out of language documentation is a variety of recordings in different contexts. So ideally you have traditional stories, songs, personal stories, stories about the area, elicited materials, so asking about different types of sentences, and getting this real variety of recordings, and hopefully working with ideally as many people as you can to capture the patterns of how the language is spoken in different contexts.
So, there are so many languages in the world, and there are so few of them that have good descriptions. So one of the things we want to try and do is figure out how to increase the amount of information that we have archived for these languages, because languages change all the time, and there are a lot of pressures on these small languages for speakers of these languages to take up metropolitan languages, often at the expense of their first language. And that doesn't need to be the case, but often it is the case that people feel that they need to adopt the metropolitan language. So making records of these languages is all the more important as we can see that there's increasing urbanisation. Climate change is forcing people to move to new places, sometimes to abandon the place where they've been living for a long time and where the language was also spoken. So when they move to a new place, they start speaking to other people, and the language is lost. So making good records is really important, and with the emergence of new technologies we can increase the way in which we can interact with old recordings. So many old recordings don't have transcripts, and there are methods now for doing speech recognition even for very small languages, and we've got examples where you only need training sets of a few hours of transcribed material in a language, and that you're then able to train the machine to transcribe or make pretty good transcripts of untranscribed material. So that means you then have a textual way of navigating through recordings, which is very important if you want to actually use the recordings for anything. And I'm sure there's going to be a whole lot of new emerging technology that we can't even imagine at the moment, but partly that could help us with social media. There's a lot of recording that people are doing, putting it onto Facebook and similar platforms, but without proper metadata and without annotations. So maybe AI can help us identify these different things and transcribe them and then make them more accessible in the future.
It's really great to work on Indigenous language documentation because a lot of languages have suffered loss because of colonisation and government policy often that has forced speakers to adopt other languages. But Indigenous languages are a really important source of pride, identity, cultural information, information about the land, and very important to the people whose communities they pull together. And so I guess in the spirit of World Voice Day, talking about resonate, educate and celebrate, connecting different communities. Hopefully as a linguist we get to platform community language projects, and in many cases there's been community members fighting for their languages, for the maintenance and revival of their languages over multiple generations. So connecting up those communities. Also, I think non-Indigenous people often have some misconceptions about Indigenous languages, and so I hope that further language documentation and sort of education in that respect can help to broaden the general public's understanding of Indigenous languages and the complexity and diversity that these languages have. And I guess in terms of celebrating these languages and the communities behind them, celebration is a really important thing because there's been a lot of really great action taken and a lot of keeping those languages strong in the face of very, very difficult circumstances. But that celebration, I think, although it's important to acknowledge it, it's also important to look at how we can further support those languages and the communities. So giving them real political power for linguistic self-determination.
So I guess like the language that I'm studying, Jogli, is a part of a group of languages called the Tungsten Octet languages, which is part of another wider grouping called Northern Naga. But the important thing to note about these languages is that they have undergone very little documentation until probably about 10-15 years ago is when was the first proper documentation has actually been done, where people have started writing grammars, writing papers, going out and doing field work with these communities. And these languages have just basically kind of gone unnoticed. Not that people didn't know that these speakers existed, but no one's actually gone out of their way to do this work, engaging with these communities. And I feel like it's after learning about these languages and the speakers and all this, I've felt that I need to continue doing what these other researchers have done and help just build up more knowledge about these languages and help preserve them. Yeah.